This is the second video lesson. It's part 2 of our first section that goes with session 1. And what we're going to talk about today is looking at the worldview from 2 different perspectives. And I want to start by showing you this. So you have the same object, but it is viewed as a very different object in terms of its identification, its function, its significance. And this is true for many, many aspects of the school experience. And we have a certain understanding of school. But in fact, because of cultural differences, many of our students come to us with a very different set of assumptions and expectations. And we're going to take a look, a deep dive, into what school looks like from 2 different perspectives. Before we do that, I want to zoom out away from education and take a look at the larger instructional context. I see it in terms of layers. The first layer I call the bedrock layer. So nobody chooses who their parents are, what decade they were born, geographically where on the planet they were born. You have no control over that. We all have bedrock. I have bedrock. You have bedrock. Immutable. That's who you are. The next layer, though, is what I call societal factors. And this has to do with the way the community you happen to be living in views your bedrock. Now, this is tricky for many of our students because in their home countries, their bedrock may have been viewed in one way by their society. Then they move to the United States and suddenly the same bedrock is viewed completely differently. So societal factors have a huge effect. Somebody could be privileged, they could be disadvantaged, discriminated against, they could be viewed as the pinnacle of that society or at the bottom. And things like language, skin color, ethnicity, all of those factors are viewed differently in different societies. And it could work either way. Sometimes we have refugees who were marginalized in their society. They come here hoping to make a new life and to be viewed differently by this society, being that it is more open to all different types of people. At least it always has been. On the other hand, sometimes it's the opposite. Someone can come here and find that they're facing all kinds of discrimination that they weren't facing. All of a sudden, they find that in their own country they were fine, but in the United States, suddenly because their skin is black, it's like, oh, you're black? Go over there. So I'm just plugging my computer in. There we go. So this is what I call the hand that you're dealt in life. Everyone's dealt a hand. It has to do with the bedrock and societal factors. And these factors are not under your control, the teacher's control. It's the way life is. It's your hand that you're dealt. I think for a minute about the hand you have been dealt in your life. And you may have been in different circumstances at different times in your life. That's possible too. So think about that for a minute. Now, I'm talking about the teaching perspective today. So, what can the teacher do? You can't change the hand they're dealt. That's out of your control. And we know that the hand they're dealt is has a big effect on how they're perceived in the school community too, because it's part of society. So, what is your job then? Well, I think there are two things that you can do as a teacher. One of them is to get to know the bedrock and societal factors that every one of your students is dealing with. The more you know about the hand they're dealt, the better. So that's number one. Number two is your job is to help them reach their potential, the potential of the hand. You can't change the hand itself, but whatever potential that student has, you want to make sure that you're tapping into that with your instruction. And that's what we're going to be looking at as we go through our culturally responsive sustaining education series of synchronous and asynchronous sessions. So now we're not actually here on this chart yet. So let me show you where we are. We're up here. This is our bread and butter. This is what they pay us big bucks for, right? Curriculum, instruction, and assessment. So think for a minute about yourselves. I can give myself as an example. My bedrock and societal factors worked, generally speaking, in my favor. Not totally, but in general. And I went straight through curriculum, assessment, instruction worked fine for me. I did very well in school, and school was not a disconnect for me based on my hand that I was dealt. All right. Some of you may have had speed bumps along the way, and you may have had some rocky times in school and not have had as smooth a time. So just take a minute and think about your own experience. Okay, now we're going to think about our students, and we know that there's something missing, right? It's right there on the chart. So there is another layer, and that layer is culturally responsive sustaining education. And without that, many of our students will not be realizing their potential. And that is what we're going to learn how to do. We're going to put in that layer, that extra layer that they need. I wouldn't have needed it when I was young and I was going through K-12. Maybe some of you would have, maybe some of you wouldn't have, but our students do. And what does it consist of? What does it look like? That's what we're here to find out. Okay, going with me on our continuing journey. That's our focus, right? We're looking right there at that layer. All right, so what we're going to do first is the hard part, which is looking at your own priorities. Now, you remember before we talked about identifying priorities in both cultures. And sometimes it's easier to identify other people's priorities because it hits you in the face. Whoa, that's important to you? But what your priorities are aren't always as obvious to you. And so I'm going to show you what I believe our priorities are in our educational system. See if you agree. The goals of K-12 instruction are to produce an independent learner and produce a learner that is prepared for a life after schooling. It sounds pretty on target, right? And we assume the learner is ready to participate and demonstrate mastery on an individual basis, right? And engage in literacy-based classroom tasks. Pretty straightforward, right? School isn't life. We know we're going to do classroom things, and it's going to have something to do with literacy. Well, I'm going to show you how many of our students, most of our students, not all, don't buy into any of this. None of this means anything to them. It's not a part of a set of priorities that they share. How can that be? Let's go see. So, you know the iceberg theory of culture, right? So, we don't look at just the food, art, music. We look deeper to the values, beliefs, attitudes, worldview, as I said earlier. So, we're going to take a look at three cultural differences that I have found to be the major ones. And this is generalizing. And sometimes, uh, academics, we are very careful not to essentialize groups of people or generalize. But I think it's helpful sometimes because so much of this is shared across many of the cultures of the world. And it's different from our system and our view. So the first difference we're going to look at is orality versus literacy. We are very literacy based. What? You're not literate, you're illiterate, you're non-literate. Literacy is essential. We'll see that. The second one we'll look at is collectivism versus individualism, which you may or may not be familiar with, and I will take you through what that looks like. And the last is informal ways of learning versus formal education. All right, let's go. What's that? It's not a trick question. What is it? You probably said circle. Sure. So you thought of it as the two-dimensional circle. And I think I mentioned in the last lesson that we were going to talk about more about two-dimensional and three-dimensional. Now I want you to imagine it's three-dimensional. So instead of circle, the shape on the flat slide there, what could it be if it were a three-dimensional object? Just name a few. You probably didn't find it very difficult to do that, right? You could say the moon, a plate, maybe an orange. Okay, a lot of things are round, right? So the difference is that many students who don't have experience with literacy and formal education or have limited experience with literacy and formal education will not come up with circle. They will come up with the three-dimensional because they live in a three-dimensional world. They're not used to two dimensions. You remember in the other lesson we talked about the map, the flat map. How can that represent real places in the world? It's flat there. So the two-dimensional, they have to learn, these students, to go from a three-dimensional world to a two-dimensional world. It's a huge leap. And I'm going to show you what this looks like. So if you show them a drawing, right? A drawing. And you say, okay, what's this? Are they going to say what you're thinking? Apple? Probably not, because it's just a bunch of lines. It's ambiguous. That's why I always say that's not the way to go. They need to learn that because maybe on standardized tests and in other measures, eventually they're going to need to look at a diagram. But we have to transition them to that. How about that? That's a little bit more like an apple, nicely sketched. Closer. It's a little easier to recognize, isn't it? Right? If you're coming from a three-dimensional world to a two, that one's a little more three-dimensional. How about this one, though? This is a photograph. That is an apple, right? Well, we have the dots. We have it. It's really jumping off the page. Pretty good, huh? How about this? Oh, now we've cut it in half. We can see the inside. We've got color. It's also a photograph. There we go, an apple. Yes? Okay, not exactly. How about this? Well, it sort of looks like an apple, but it's actually something I use a lot. It's a stress ball, right? It's not an apple, but it's three-dimensional. Okay. Now I want to show you one more. Watch. That was an apple. Okay. So you have the touch, the smell, the texture, the taste. You've got your senses, okay? So let's remember that there's a transition going on, and materials that have real photographs or using real objects are going to get a lot more attention and validation for your students. All right, so take a look at these pictures, and what do you notice? Okay. You may notice the prevalence of literacy. If you're without literacy, you're not going to be doing very well in our society, even to take subways, to get gas, to find your way on the highway, etc., and certainly in school. So here's a quote from one of my students. The most importance I've learned about the United States, that is a book, newspapers, or notebook and pens. These things are always let me know how to live here. Notice I underlined and bolded live. It's not just about school. That's why we start with the whole, looking back at the large picture, because it's everywhere. Now, to that point, here is a quote from my colleague's student. I never care about reading until I come here. In my country, nothing to read, but here, everywhere, print, words, signs, and books, and you have to read. So it's everywhere. It hits you in the face. But in some countries, rural areas of countries where many of our students come from, they're not surrounded by print. Just think of how different that would be. Environmental print just isn't part of your daily life. That's an important difference. So literacy is a cognitive change for many of our students. I've had students who I know that they could literally read the material at their instructional level, but they still turned to me and they still wanted the interpersonal. They wanted me to talk them through it because that's their orality coming through, their preference for orality. Does that sound familiar to you? Now, the next difference is collectivism versus individualism. So let's look at collectivism. It turns out that they think about we rather than I. They know they're an I, but everything is in terms of the we. They see themselves as connected, like a web. You see, we use the web as a symbol of this kind of thinking. And even when they achieve something as an individual, it's to bring pride to the larger group that they're part of, right? And you might identify certain aspects of, a team that wins, and then it's for everybody, and even though they're individual players, that kind of thing. We do have a little bit of that, but 70% of the world's cultures, Triandus has done research on this, and Hofstede also, and they have a continuum of cultures. And the United States is pretty far over on the other end, whereas many, many countries, most of which are countries that our students come from as immigrants and refugees, are collectivistic. Their worldview is collectivism, and they get a real shock when they come here because, hey, call on me, right? You're expected to act as an individual. You're expected to raise your hand, and you get praise for personal efforts. People care what you're interested in, what your opinion is. You're supposed to take personal responsibility, and self-actualization is highly valued. This is individualism. It's a huge part of our society. And you need to be able to kind of put your mind around it. And I've had a lot of students say to me, oh, but we do group work and we interact, but that is an activity. And in fact, many times students, they don't want to do group work. Oh, I did my share, I did my part. Why do I have to work in a group? Oh, that's the individualism coming through, right? So I'm guessing that you get the idea now. We're going to talk a lot more about it when we get to the learning paradigm that I'm going to teach you that will help you in the classroom. Right now, we're doing the theoretical piece, which I think is very important because I'm not going to just tell you do this, do this, do this. You have to know why. You have to understand. Just like when we did schema theory, you need to get the theoretical background. That's what this is. Very important. The third cultural difference is informal ways of learning. Mentorship, right? Journaling. A journeyman learns, or a child, you can see in the photo, right? Learns as soon as they can contribute to their community, they're going to do it. Cook the rice, or go to the field, or whatever they're going to do, right? They do it as soon as they can. So it's the immediate needs of the family and the community, right? And it's grounded in observation, participation, and they learn the practices of their community. That's how they're schooled, right? Informally, with no particular timetable. It happens when it happens. And it's always relevant. It's immediately relevant. They don't go to school for 4 years to study farming and then go out in the field. They go out. They get feedback. They practice. They try again. They get better. They watch people who are good at it. And it's centered on orality. We're not talking about literacy here. We're talking about interpersonal learning, oral transmission. What do we have? Oh, well, you know what we have. We have age cohorts, knowledge and disciplines, literacy is central. This is all very familiar. And it's based on, and this is important, the last one might be a little new for you, the way I describe, and my co-author with me in our work together, describe the real essence of what makes school school, is that it's based on academic ways of thinking and school-based decontextualized tasks. What do we mean by academic ways of thinking? What do we mean by decontextualized tasks? And we're going to do a lot of work with that. But I'm going to start by giving you some examples. So tell me here, we do definitions, right? So if I say, what is a tree? What is a tree? You probably said something like a large plant. Well, behind me is not a tree, it's a plant, but on this side. But you probably said branches and a trunk, right? And it grows and it's, alive. That's not the way a tree would be defined by many of our students. They might talk about it provides shade, it provides nutritious food that they can get from the tree, or they can use the wood to build something with. They would give a functional view of what the tree means in their lives. They're providing a context, right? What you were doing, the school-based way, was not putting it in a context, taking it out of a context, and describing it in purely academic terms. Another example, true-false. So we say Washington, D.C. is the capital of the U.S. True. New York City, capital of New York State. So I've had students say to me, I'm learning to read in English, and you put a sentence that's false? You're trying to trick me? Why are you doing that? You think I'm learning from that? And of course we go, yes, you're developing critical thinking skills. I want to know if you can catch that. But for them, it's trickery, confusion. I'm learning to read. Put it in print is sacred. You've put it in print. I'm reading it, and then you tell me it's not true? It's false? And all of this is compounded by everything that we are actually currently surrounded by, but that's not our topic today. The third example I'll give you is classification. We do this a lot. So for example, categorize these objects. What's salient here? What's salient? What is this? If you're a parent, or an aunt or uncle, you'll know right away what's important here, what this is. It's a shape sorter. So what's important are the shapes, not the colors. If you try and pay attention to color, you're just getting distracted. But how would you know if you haven't been trained in this kind of activity of categorizing and classifying? Okay. Now I'm going to give you a little test to see if you understand what I've been showing you. And I gave you a preview of this when we met synchronously. So here it is. Remember? What is the group? Which item does not belong? Which item does not belong? And here we go. All right. Which item does not belong? This is for a standardized test. Okay. And the group, what is the group? Okay. Now, I want you to think of our students. Would they necessarily do that if they're not used to classifying? They might actually keep the log intentionally to create a context, real world context. Remember, again, the three-dimensional world, the real world, contextualization is very important to them. It doesn't make sense to go around with three tools if you don't have a log. You're just walking around with tools. You can't do anything. But if you have a log, you can start doing something. Now, some people say get rid of the hammer because what are you going to do? Hammer the log. It's not important. The important thing here is not which one they would throw away. It's the fact that Luria, in research in the former Soviet Union in 1976, person after person after person, none of them got rid of the log. So does that help you understand why standardized tests are so abysmal for some of our students? Because it's the way they think. It's not about ability. They're trying to find a context. They're trying to make it make sense. And there'll be a lot more examples that we'll do together. So do you remember the three major differences that we talked about? Here they are. Orality versus literacy, collectivism versus individualism, informal ways of learning versus formal education. Those are the three differences. Now, let's go back to our slide from earlier. Think about this. Produce an independent learner. Which one does that remind you of? Why would that not resonate? Collectivism, right? Prepare the learner for life after schooling. After schooling? Immediate relevance, serving the needs of the community, informal learning. Doesn't resonate. How about participate and demonstrate mastery on an individual basis? Back again to collectivism. We work together, we help each other. Oh yeah, you can help today in the group, but there's a test tomorrow. No more help. We'll be talking about that. And the last one, engage in literacy-based classroom tasks. So the literacy-based, orality versus literacy. They much prefer orality. And classroom tasks, that's what we're talking about with the decontextualized tasks, and underlying them are the academic ways of thinking. Classifying, defining, comparing, contrasting, all cause and effect, all of those ways of thinking that we ask them to demonstrate through these decontextualized tasks. Is it any wonder they're not reaching their potential? We're not giving an inch, and they don't even know what the issue is. But I'll tell you what the issue is, and then we'll close. The issue is what we call cultural dissonance. And I leave you with that.